The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on Hollywood Boulevard, its golden light flickering against the glass windows of high-end boutiques and luxury hotels. Tourists snapped pictures near the Walk of Fame, while street performers juggled flaming torches for loose change. The air buzzed with the sounds of honking cars, distant laughter, and the occasional guitar strum from a hopeful musician on the sidewalk. Tom Cruise, wearing a simple black cap and sunglasses, moved through the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to being noticed but hoping, for once, not to be. He had just left a business meeting at a nearby hotel, discussing a potential new film project, a high-stakes action thriller. Yet, at this moment, he was simply enjoying the rare pleasure of anonymity, blending into the lively streets of Los Angeles. As he approached a crosswalk, a figure sitting on the pavement caught his eye. A homeless man, slouched against a lamppost, his clothes tattered, his hands cupped together. His face, rough with an unshaven beard and streaked with dirt, carried the exhaustion of a man who had lived too many hard days. His eyes, however, held something different: sharpness, awareness. He wasn't just another forgotten soul lost in the chaos of the city. The man's gaze locked onto Tom's as he passed. "Hey, man," the homeless man said, his voice raspy but steady. "Can you spare $1?" Tom paused mid-step. The question, so simple, yet direct, hung in the air between them. People nearby barely noticed, accustomed to passing by without a second thought. But Tom did not move on. He studied the man for a moment, then removed his sunglasses, revealing the unmistakable intensity in his eyes. A smile, small, knowing, touched the corner of Tom's lips. "You're asking me for $1?" he asked, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made the question feel almost surreal. The homeless man squinted, as if seeing Tom for the first time. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but he gave no indication of awe or surprise. Instead, he let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah," the man shrugged. "Ain't you got one?" Tom tilted his head slightly, intrigued. He could have simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over a crisp bill. That would have been easy, expected, but something about the man's tone, about the way he asked, not pleading, not desperate, just asking, made him hesitate. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them moved on, the city humming with its usual rhythm. But something was about to happen, something no one watching could have predicted. Tom didn't answer right away. He studied the man before him, taking in every detail: the worn-out jacket with a tear at the sleeve, the way his fingers twitched slightly, as if in used to stillness, the sharpness in his eyes that suggested he was far from broken, even if life had tried to break him. People around them moved without a second glance, stepping past as if this interaction was just another insignificant moment in a city full of them. But Tom knew better. He had spent years perfecting the art of reading people, understanding the unspoken, the stories hidden beneath the surface. And this man, this wasn't someone begging for the sake of begging. There was something else here, something unspoken in the way he had asked for that single dollar, in the way he was waiting, watching, expecting a response that wasn't just charity. Tom reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and held it open just enough for the man to see that there were plenty of bills inside. 20s, 50s, hundreds, but he didn't take one out. He looked down at the man, his expression unreadable, then tilted his head slightly. "If I give you $1, what are you gonna do with it?" His tone wasn't mocking, wasn't patronizing, just genuinely curious. The man didn't hesitate. "That's my business." His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. "I asked for $1, not an interview." Tom exhaled a quiet laugh, not of amusement, but of recognition. There was no desperation in the man's tone, no pleading, no attempt to convince him. It wasn't the usual script. Most people in this situation would have launched into a story, a justification, a reason that might tug at the conscience of someone with money in his pocket. But this man didn't care about playing that game, and that made Tom even more interested. "That's fair," Tom said, closing his wallet without taking anything out. "But you know who I am, right?" The man's lips curled slightly, almost like a smirk, but he gave a small shrug. "Yeah, you're Tom Cruise, Hollywood star, action guy." You run in movies like a man who's got somewhere real important to be. That answer made Tom smile, a genuine one this time. The way the man said it, so matter-of-factly, without awe or flattery, like he was just stating something as obvious as the weather, was refreshing. Most people, when they recognized him, had an immediate reaction: excitement, admiration, sometimes nervousness. But this man didn't seem affected at all, didn't shift in the slightest. That was rare. "So you know I could give you way more than $1, Tom continued, watching him carefully. "You asked for one, but I could hand you 100 or 1,000, and it wouldn't mean anything to me. And if I do, what then?" The man's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but his expression remained calm. "Then you'd feel good about yourself for doing something nice, and I'd have 100 or 1,000 bucks." He paused, tilting his head slightly, mirroring Tom's posture now. "But that's not what you're gonna do, is it?" Tom felt the energy in the air shift slightly, the tension between them changing into something more than a simple conversation. The way the man said it, like he already knew, like he had already figured out how this was going to go, was what convinced Tom to do the opposite of what anyone else might expect. "You're right," Tom said, slipping his wallet back into his pocket. "I'm not." He took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. "But I will give you something else." The man raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not impressed. "Like what? A life lesson?" Tom shook his head. "No, a job." That finally got a reaction. The man blinked, the first sign of real surprise, but he masked it quickly. He didn't laugh, didn't scoff, just narrowed his eyes slightly. "A job doing what, exactly?" Tom gestured toward the street, toward the restaurants, the stores, the people walking by, oblivious to the moment unfolding between them. "Anything you want. You say yes, and I'll find you work, something you're actually good at, something that gives you more than just enough for the next meal. But I'm not handing you cash, and I'm not making this easy. You asked me for $1. I'm offering you something better. Your move." The man stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly, his fingers clenching and unclenching on his lap. The confidence, the sharpness, those were still there, but now something else had surfaced, something deeper, something that couldn't be hidden behind quick words and unwavering eye contact. He had not expected this. He had been prepared for rejection, for indifference, even for a dismissive handout. But an offer like this? That wasn't in the script. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, as if the entire city had faded into the background, leaving only the two of them standing at a crossroads neither had planned to reach. Then, finally, the man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving Tom's. "You serious?" His voice was quieter now, but not weak, just cautious, like someone testing the ground beneath their feet after too many falls. Tom nodded. "Completely." The man studied him for a few more seconds, then exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "You really don't do things like other people, do you?" A small grin tugged at the corner of Tom's mouth. "No, I don't." The man ran a hand through his messy hair, then glanced at the street, at the people passing by, at the world that had ignored him for so long. He tapped his fingers against his knee, thinking, measuring. Then, finally, he looked back at Tom, eyes sharper than ever, filled with something that hadn't been there before. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you got." And just like that, everything changed. Tom didn't hesitate once the man gave his answer. He nodded, as if he had expected it all along, and gestured for the man to stand up. The man hesitated for a moment, as if testing whether this was real, whether this wasn't just another meaningless conversation that would end the moment Tom walked away. But there was something in Tom's expression, an unwavering certainty, an unspoken challenge, that made it impossible to dismiss. The man slowly pushed himself up, his movements stiff, as if his body wasn't used to being acknowledged, to being needed for anything more than survival. He brushed the dust from his worn-out jeans, then looked at Tom, waiting for whatever came next. Tom started walking, weaving through the crowd with purpose, not looking back to see if the man was following. The man hesitated only a second before falling into step beside him, keeping up without effort. They walked past souvenir shops, overpriced cafes, and street performers balancing on stilts, all blending into the background of a city that never paused. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't friendly either. It was charged, like two people sizing each other up, neither entirely sure what to expect. After a few blocks, Tom stopped in front of a small restaurant with a sleek, modern exterior and large glass windows. Inside, waiters in crisp black uniforms moved between tables, carrying plates of food that cost more than the man had probably seen in weeks. It wasn't a high-end celebrity spot, but it was far from a casual diner. Tom pushed open the door and stepped inside, the smell of grilled steak and fresh herbs filling the air. The man hesitated at the entrance, his posture shifting slightly, as if preparing for someone to tell him to leave. But Tom just turned to him and gestured toward the bar area. "Take a seat," Tom said, walking over to a man in his 40s, dressed in a dark blue apron, discussing something with a waiter. The restaurant owner, probably. The man sat down at the bar, his fingers tapping against the polished wood, his eyes moving around the space, taking everything in. He didn't look uncomfortable, but there was an alertness in the way he held himself, as if he was waiting for the moment someone would remind him that he didn't belong here. Tom spoke briefly with the owner, his voice calm but firm, his gestures precise. The owner looked skeptical at first, glancing toward the man at the bar, then back at Tom. There was a pause, a slight shift in the conversation, then a nod. The owner motioned toward one of the waiters, who walked toward the man at the bar, expression unreadable. "You looking for work?" the waiter asked, stopping a few feet away, as if unsure whether to fully engage. The man turned slightly, his eyes narrowing. He glanced toward Tom, who was now leaning against the counter, arms crossed, waiting to see what he would do. "What kind of work?" the man asked, his tone neutral, giving nothing away. "Kitchen help," the waiter said, watching him carefully. "Cleaning, prepping ingredients, maybe some dishwashing. It's not much, but it's something." The man let out a quiet breath, considering. His fingers stopped tapping against the bar. He looked at the restaurant again, his eyes moving from the polished floors to the neatly arranged silverware on the tables. This was a test. He knew it, and Tom knew it. If he said no, the conversation would end, and he would walk back out onto the street the same as before. If he said yes, everything would shift, and there would be no turning back. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once. "When do I start?" The waiter glanced toward the owner, who gave another nod from across the room. "Now," the waiter said. The man exhaled sharply, like he had expected at least a few more minutes to process what was happening, but he didn't protest. He stood up, adjusted his jacket like it still mattered, then followed the waiter through a side door into the kitchen without another word. Tom watched him go, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly. Then he walked out of the restaurant without saying anything else. The test had begun. The kitchen was a different world, a place where time moved faster, where every second mattered, and where hesitation had no place. The air was thick with the smell of garlic, grilled meat, and something fried sizzling in hot oil. Pans clattered, knives chopped against wooden boards, orders were shouted over the sound of boiling water and the metallic hum of industrial refrigerators. The man barely had time to take in the chaos before a younger worker shoved a damp apron into his hands and motioned toward a deep stainless steel sink filled with dishes. The stack was high, plates smeared with remnants of expensive meals, glasses coated in fingerprints, silverware tangled together in a mess that no one had bothered to sort. "Start with these," the young worker said quickly, barely looking at him before moving toward a station where someone was chopping onions at an impossible speed. The man stood there for a second, the weight of everything settling in. He hadn't washed dishes in years. He had done plenty of things. Odd jobs, hustles, anything that kept him going. But standing in a real kitchen, working an actual shift, was something different. He looked at the sink, at the grease clinging to the plates, at the endless flow of new dishes piling up from waiters swinging through the doors. He could leave. No one was watching him too closely. He could drop the apron, walk out, find another way to survive. But then what? Go back to the street, back to being invisible, back to knowing he had a chance and threw it away? He clenched his jaw, tied the apron around his waist, rolled up his sleeves, and plunged his hands into the hot, soapy water. The first dish slipped in his grip, almost crashing against the side of the sink, but he caught it just in time. He scrubbed, rinsed, stacked, again, and again, and again. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The pile never got smaller. The heat from the kitchen made sweat drip down the back of his neck. His hands ached, his arms stiffened, but no one told him to stop. No one gave him a break, and he didn't ask for one. The other workers moved around him like he had always been there, never giving him special treatment, never acting like he was anything but another part of the kitchen. Then came the next test. A chef, his face red from the heat of the stove, turned suddenly and pointed at him. "Hey, new guy, you ever chop vegetables?" The man blinked, straightened, wiped his hands on the apron. "Yeah," he said. "Good. Prove it." A cutting board was slapped onto the counter in front of him. A bag of carrots was tossed beside it, a sharp knife placed on top. "Julienne cut. Fast. Let's see what you got." The man picked up the knife, his grip instinctive, but his hesitation obvious. He hadn't done this in years. He used to be good with a knife, real good, but that was before everything had unraveled. He set a carrot on the board, pressed the tip of the knife against the skin, and started slicing. Too slow. "Faster!" the chef barked, already turning away to stir a pot bubbling with something thick and dark. The man gritted his teeth and picked up the pace. The knife moved quicker, the cuts becoming smoother, more even. The muscle memory returned, his fingers adjusting without thinking. The rhythm steadied. The sound of the blade against the board became part of the kitchen's noise, blending into the controlled chaos. When he finished, he stepped back, shaking out his tense fingers. The chef glanced at the pile, nodded slightly, then grabbed the chopped carrots and dumped them into a pan without another word. No praise, no criticism, just work. The hours blurred together. More dishes, more chopping, more movement. By the time someone finally muttered, "Shift's over," he barely had the energy to untie the apron. He pulled it off, hung it where the others had, and ran a hand through his damp hair. The young worker who had handed him the apron earlier passed by, tossing a nod in his direction. "Not bad. See you tomorrow?" The man hesitated, then nodded once. "Yeah." He pushed open the back door of the kitchen and stepped into the cool night air. The city still buzzed, but it was different now, quieter, as if even Los Angeles had to take a breath after a long day. He leaned against the brick wall, exhaling slowly, letting the exhaustion settle into his bones. Then he saw him. Tom stood across the alley, leaning against a car, arms crossed. "You actually did it," Tom said, his voice even, no trace of surprise. The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You thought I wouldn't?" Tom pushed off the car, stepping closer, his expression unreadable. "Most people wouldn't." The man shrugged, glancing back at the kitchen door. "I'm not most people." Tom studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "No, you're not." The man wasn't sure what to say next. He wasn't sure what this had been, what Tom had been expecting. Was this some kind of game, some social experiment, some test of character? He didn't know, and he wasn't sure he cared. What mattered was that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just another person on the sidewalk, waiting for the world to ignore him. Tom reached into his pocket, pulled out something, and held it out. A $1 bill. The man looked at it, then back at Tom, confused. "You asked for $1, Tom said. "You earned it." The man stared at the bill for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took it. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the worn paper, the weight of something that suddenly meant more than it should. Then, without a word, he folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. It was never about the money. The man stood there, the dollar bill resting in his pocket like something heavier than paper, something that carried a weight he hadn't felt in years. He didn't look at it again. He didn't need to. Tom watched him carefully, his expression neutral, his stance relaxed. But there was something underneath it, something that suggested he had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see what the man would do next. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows onto the pavement. The sounds of the city continued in the background, distant car horns, voices from a nearby bar, the occasional shuffle of footsteps as someone passed by without a second glance. The man exhaled, rubbing his hands together, feeling the dried soap and grease still clinging to his skin from the long hours in the kitchen. He had expected exhaustion, and it was there, creeping into his bones. But there was something else, something unfamiliar, something that made him stand a little straighter instead of slumping back into the comfort of defeat. He glanced at Tom, narrowing his eyes slightly, as if trying to read him, as if trying to figure out why this man, of all people, had chosen to stop, to offer something more than $1, to turn a simple request into something much bigger than he had ever intended. "You set me up," the man finally said, his voice even, not angry, just stating the truth as he saw it. Tom didn't flinch. "I gave you a choice," the man scoffed, shaking his head, looking down at the pavement before meeting Tom's eyes again. "You could have just given me the money and walked away like everybody else, but you wanted something. What was it? Some kind of test? Some lesson to make you feel better about yourself?" Tom held his gaze, unshaken, unbothered by the accusation. "You tell me," he said simply. The man clenched his jaw, the tension flickering through him before he forced himself to relax. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to believe this was some rich guy's game, that this was about power, about control. But the truth, the real truth, was that no one had ever looked at him the way Tom had that day. No one had ever asked him what he would do with $1, had ever expected an answer that wasn't just survival. And no one, not a single person in all the years he had been on the streets, had ever offered him something that wasn't just a handout, something that demanded more than just holding out his palm and waiting. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble against his fingers. "I used to cook," he muttered, more to himself than to Tom. "A long time ago." Tom didn't react. He just waited. The man swallowed, glancing back toward the restaurant, toward the kitchen he had just left, the place where, for the first time in years, someone had expected something from him and not just ignored him. "Not in places like that," he continued, his voice quiet but steady. "Better places. Real kitchens. Places where people cared about what they put on a plate. I was good. Not the best, but good." Tom nodded, as if he had already known. "What happened?" The man let out a bitter laugh. "What always happens? Life." He shook his head. "I had a restaurant. Not mine, but I ran the kitchen. Worked my ass off. Then one bad decision turned into another, then another, and suddenly everything I built, everything I worked for, was gone. And once you fall far enough, no one's waiting to pull you back up." Tom studied him, his expression unreadable, but not indifferent. He wasn't pitying him, wasn't offering empty words of sympathy. He was just listening, like the story mattered. The man exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know what the worst part is?" He looked up, his eyes sharp, filled with something that had been buried under years of exhaustion. It wasn't the fall. It wasn't losing everything. It was realizing that people stop seeing you as a person, that you become something they step over, something they ignore. It's not even about the money. It's about the fact that nobody thinks you can ever be anything more than what you are in that moment. Tom nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he let on. Then he reached into his pocket again, but this time, he didn't pull out money. He pulled out a business card. He held it out, but the man didn't take it right away. "What's this?" Tom didn't answer immediately. "A name. A place where you can work. A real shot, not just washing dishes in the back of a restaurant for a few bucks an hour. You take it, you show up, and they'll give you a chance. That's it. No guarantees. Just a chance." The man stared at the card, his fingers twitching slightly. "Why?" Tom tilted his head slightly. "Because I know what it's like when people decide who you are before you even get the chance to show them." The man swallowed, looking at Tom, really looking at him, and for the first time, he saw something beyond the celebrity, beyond the movies, beyond the headlines. He saw someone who had fought his own battles, someone who had faced expectations, who had refused to let the world define him. He saw someone who wasn't offering charity, but respect. Slowly, the man reached out and took the card. He didn't look at it yet, just held it, feeling the weight of it between his fingers. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Tom gave him a small nod, then stepped back toward his car. "I hope I don't see you on this street again," he said, not as a threat, not as a dismissal, but as something else, something that felt more like belief than expectation. The man watched as Tom got into the car and drove off, the sound of the engine fading into the night. He stood there for a long time, the business card in one pocket, the dollar bill in the other. Then, finally, he pulled out the card, turned it over in his fingers, and read the name. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something real, a beginning.